Within 16 days, 3 separate killings turned one operation into a spiral that no one could stop. It begins on a sunny Sunday in Gibraltar, on the 6th of March 1988, when the SAS shoot 3 unarmed IRA volunteers dead on a pavement. It does not end there. 10 days later, on the 16th of March, their coffins are carried into Milltown Cemetery in West Belfast. Tens of thousands of mourners are there. Television cameras are there. And so is a man named Michael Stone, alone, with grenades and 2 pistols, who walks among the graves and begins throwing and firing, killing 3 people and wounding more than 60, before he is chased to a motorway. 3 days after that, on the 19th of March, the funeral of one of Stone's victims is moving through Andersonstown, when a silver Volkswagen drives into the crowd. Inside are 2 British Army corporals in plain clothes. The crowd, believing it is another Michael Stone, drags them from the car. Within minutes, both men are dead. 3 funerals, 3 attacks, 16 days. And it all started with 27 seconds on a pavement in Gibraltar. This is the companion to a story this channel has told before. In the operations the SAS still won't discuss, and again in the account of Operation Flavius itself, the question was always, what happened on the rock? This is the other half of the answer. It is about what happened after. Because Flavius did not end when the shooting stopped in Gibraltar. The planners on the rock had a single objective, and once it was met, in their account, the operation was over. It was not over. It had only changed shape. What follows is a case file on 16 days, told the way the documentary record allows it to be told, forensically, with the disputes left standing where they stand, and with the dead on every side treated as dead. Start with day 1, because the clock starts there. The 6th of March 1988. Gibraltar, the small British territory at the southern tip of Spain. 3 members of a provisional IRA active service unit were in the town. Daniel McCann, Mairead Farrell, who was 31, and Sean Savage, the youngest, in his early 20s. British and Spanish intelligence had been tracking them. The belief, set out later in the European Court of Human Rights judgment, was that they intended to detonate a car bomb during the changing of the guard, a military ceremony that drew crowds. Soldiers of the SAS were deployed in plain clothes. When the 3 were on foot in the town, the soldiers moved in and opened fire. All 3 were shot dead in the street. Then the facts that turned a counter-terrorism operation into a 30-year argument. The 3 were unarmed. There was no detonator on any of them. And the car they had parked in Gibraltar contained no bomb. 2 days later, a second car was found in a car park in Marbella, 50 miles away across the Spanish border. That one did contain explosives, a large quantity of Semtex with detonators and timers. But it was a conventional timer device, and it was nowhere near the people who had been shot. The documentary record establishes only this: that the SAS soldiers testified they had been briefed the team would carry a remote push-button detonator, and that the parked car definitely held a bomb, and that both of those briefings turned out to be wrong. What followed in Gibraltar was an inquest, and what followed the inquest was a long legal road. The inquest jury returned, by 9 votes to 2, the verdict the law calls lawful killing. But the families pursued the case to Strasbourg, and in September 1995, the European Court of Human Rights handed down its judgment in McCann and others against the United Kingdom. It is the first decision the court ever made on Article 2, the right to life. By the narrowest of margins, 10 judges to 9, it found the United Kingdom in violation. Not because the individual soldiers had done anything unlawful in the instant they fired. The court accepted they had acted on honest belief. The violation lay in the planning and control of the whole operation. The failure to arrest the 3 at the border before they ever entered the town, and the failure to allow for the possibility that the intelligence was simply wrong. The court's language was that the use of force had not been, in its words, absolutely necessary. That is the legal verdict on day 1. A court would later rule the operation had been planned in violation of the 3 volunteers' right to life. We will not relitigate Gibraltar beyond this. That is the companion video's work. What matters here is the date and the clock it started. Because the brief for this story is not Gibraltar. It is what Gibraltar set in motion. So hold the image and move the calendar forward. 3 coffins and a city about to receive them. To understand the next 10 days, you have to understand what an IRA funeral was in 1988. It was not a private event. It was a mass political occasion watched by the whole world's press, contested at every turn between the Republican movement and the state. Peter Taylor, in Provos, his history of the IRA and Sinn Féin, built on interviews across the army, the police and both governments, describes how completely the Republican movement had learned to use the funeral as a stage, and how completely the British state had learned to fear it. A funeral was a count of strength. It was a recruiting ground. It was a film set for an argument about legitimacy that both sides took deadly seriously. The bodies of McCann, Farrell and Savage were flown out of Gibraltar and brought first to Dublin, where around 2,000 people met the coffins, and then driven north into West Belfast. Accounts differ slightly on the exact day they crossed into Belfast, somewhere around the 14th of March. But the destination was not in doubt. They were taken to their family homes, and then, on the 16th, they would be buried together in the Republican plot at Milltown Cemetery. By the time the coffins reached the city, the funeral had already been the subject of negotiation, confrontation, and intense international attention. The cameras of the world's broadcasters were positioned around the cemetery before a single mourner arrived. The atmosphere around those funerals was charged in a way that is difficult to convey now. There had already been confrontations over the bodies, and there was a deliberate decision urged at the highest levels of the Anglo-Irish relationship that the policing of these funerals had to be handled with extreme sensitivity. The record is contested on exactly who decided what, but the effect on the ground on the 16th of March was visible. The RUC kept a low profile at Miltown. The police were not standing among the graves. The funeral, in security terms, was being left to police itself. Remember that, because it is part of why what happened next was able to happen at all. Day 10, the 16th of March 1988. Milltown Cemetery on the hill above the Falls Road in West Belfast. Tens of thousands of mourners. The 3 coffins carried to the Republican plot. Television cameras present because the world was watching this funeral. And among the crowd, unnoticed, one man. His name was Michael Stone. He was a loyalist associated with the Ulster Defence Association. He had come alone. He was carrying 2 RGD-5 hand grenades, a Browning 9mm pistol and a Ruger revolver. As the 3rd coffin was about to be lowered into the ground, he threw a grenade toward the Republican plot. Then another. Then he opened fire. What happened next was filmed as it happened. Stone moved away from the graves, back across the open ground of the cemetery, toward the motorway, the M1, that runs below it. He did not run cleanly. He stopped and turned and threw grenades and fired and moved again. A section of the crowd went after him across open ground into the line of fire. He kept going. When his pistol jammed, he switched to the revolver. He was caught near the motorway, dragged down and beaten by the men who had chased him. And then he was reached by the RUC, who took him into custody, alive. The whole sequence, the throwing, the chase, the figure firing as he retreated across a graveyard, was broadcast. People watched it live. 3 people died in those minutes. Thomas McAleen was 20 years old, a civilian. John Murray was 26, a civilian. And Queeveen MacBrodie, known also as Kevin Brady, was 30, a member of the IRA, who died trying to stop the man with the grenades. More than 60 other people were wounded. That figure of more than 60 comes from Lost Lives, the standard archival roll of every death of the conflict, compiled by David McKittrick and his co-authors. Their account notes that the wounded included a pregnant mother, an elderly woman, and a 10-year-old child. Accounts diverge slightly on the count. Some contemporary records, including the Kane chronology, put the wounded at 50. The honest figure is more than 60 by the careful tally, around 50 by the early count. Either way, the wounded were overwhelmingly ordinary mourners, and the careful number is the one to hold. Michael Stone was convicted the following year, in 1989. The charges ran to the 3 deaths at Miltown and 3 earlier ones he admitted to, and the sentences totalled 682 years. He would serve about 13 of them before release under the Good Friday Agreement. Martin Dillon, the journalist who later wrote the book Stone Cold after extended conversations with him in prison, described a man who was boastful and self-mythologizing about what he had done. That is precisely the trap. A word on how we are telling this. There is a temptation with a figure like Stone to make him larger than he was, to repeat his own version, to dwell on him. We will not. He was a lone gunman who walked into a funeral with grenades, and the record of what he did is enough. The case file does not need the embellishment, and it does not need his commentary. That is day 10. Now the spiral tightens, because Miltown did not end the chain. It created the conditions for the next link. One of the 3 Stone had shot, Queeveen MacBrodie, was himself an IRA volunteer. His funeral would be held 3 days later, and this time West Belfast would be ready for an attack. Day 13. The 19th of March, 1988. The funeral of Queeveen MacBrodie. The cortege set out to move along the Andersonstown road toward Miltown, the same cemetery where 72 hours earlier the man being buried had himself been shot. Consider the state of the crowd. They had buried the Gibraltar 3 under gunfire. They had watched a lone loyalist walk among them throwing grenades. They were now burying one of his victims, and every person in that cortege was braced for it to happen again. Stewards watched the cars. Mourners scanned the roads. The whole event was held under the assumption that another attacker might come at any moment. That assumption is the hinge on which everything turns. What happened next is where the documentary trail thins, and where it has stayed contested for more than 30 years. So let us be precise about what is established and what is disputed. What is established? A silver Volkswagen Passat came toward the cortege. Inside were 2 men in civilian clothes. They were British Army corporals, Derek Wood, who was 24, and David Howes, who was 23. Both were members of the Royal Corps of Signals. The car drove toward the procession, and to a crowd already certain that an attack was coming, the sight of an unmarked car driving at a Republican funeral could mean only one thing. They believed it was another Michael Stone. The car was surrounded. One of the corporals, Wood, fired a shot in the air, which only confirmed the crowd's fear. The two men were dragged from the vehicle. Now the dispute, and it is load-bearing, so it gets stated and not resolved. Why were Wood and Howes there at all? The official British Army account is that they had blundered in, that they had ignored standing orders to keep away from the area of the funeral, and that they accidentally drove into the cortege. They were signals corporals, not a frontline surveillance team, and on this account it was a fatal navigational error, driving too close to the most dangerous funeral in Ireland that week. Against that stands a second account that has never gone away. Republicans at the scene, and later a former soldier named Sean Hartnett, who had served in a military communications and surveillance unit, argued the corporals were connected to intelligence work. Out of uniform, in an unmarked car, near a Republican event under maximum scrutiny. Hartnett's own version, set out in his book, is that they were not on a sanctioned operation at all. That one of them was effectively showing the area to a newly arrived colleague. So even the insider account converges on it not being an ordered surveillance task, while never quite dispelling the suspicion that two soldiers from a unit with intelligence functions had a reason to be there. The record is contested. It was disputed at the time, and it has never been fully resolved. What is not in dispute is what the crowd believed in the moment, that they were under attack again. The two corporals were taken from the road. They were carried to nearby waste ground, off the main road, past the sports ground at Casement Park. And there is one figure in the middle of this who has to be named, because his presence is the human centre of the whole 16 days. A priest, Father Alec Reid, from the Redemptorist community at Clonard, was at the funeral, and he went after the men. We will not reproduce the detail of what was done to the corporals beyond what the narrative requires. They were beaten, and they were taken to the waste ground, and there they were shot dead by the IRA. Father Reid reached them. By his own account, he got down on the ground between the two soldiers and held them. He tried to give one of them the kiss of life, and his own face was marked with blood as he did it. He realized they were beyond help, and he gave them the last rites. He said afterwards that as he lay between them, he had thought to himself, in his own words, "This shouldn't be happening in a civilized society." A photographer named David Cairns captured him kneeling over one of the bodies, and that single image went around the world. It became one of the defining photographs of the entire conflict. And there is one more fact about the corporals' deaths, and it is the one the brief asks us to keep. And the research confirms it. Their last moments were filmed. A British Army helicopter was hovering over Andersonstown, its camera transmitting a live picture back to a control room. A separate army patrol on the ground, Royal Scots, later said they had watched the attack and been told not to intervene. So the same security architecture that had set the clock running in Gibraltar was, 16 days later, watching the last link in the chain through a lens from the air, and not stopping it. That is not embellishment, that is in the record. Now the reckoning, because each of these events ran on into the courts, and the courts are part of the case file. Michael Stone, as we said, was convicted in 1989. The men prosecuted over the corporals were tried that same year. Two men, Alex Murphy and Harry Maguire, were convicted over the two deaths and given life sentences with long minimum terms. The trial judge, Brian Hutton, described what had been done to the two soldiers as particularly savage. A separate group of men, dubbed the casement accused, were prosecuted on a common purpose basis for their part in the events around the car. Some of those convictions were later quashed on appeal. Most of those imprisoned across these cases were released, like Stone, under the prisoner provisions of the Good Friday Agreement a decade later. That is one way to tell the story of the 16 days, as a sequence of crimes, each with its own file, its own trial, its own sentence. But there is another way, and it is the one that mattered most at the time. All of this had been seen. The Milltown attack was broadcast. The corporals were filmed from the air. For the first time, a mass audience on the British mainland watched the texture of the conflict in close to real time, not as a news summary, but as raw footage. And running underneath it, since the previous spring, was the argument over Gibraltar itself, brought to a head by a Thames television documentary, Death on the Rock, broadcast in April 1988. It presented eyewitness claims that the three in Gibraltar had been shot without warning. The government condemned it. The Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, called it, in effect, the day freedom dies. Thames commissioned an independent inquiry by Lord Windlesham and the barrister Richard Rampton, which largely defended the programme while noting errors. The film and the row around it reshaped how the operation on the Rock was understood. Taken together, the broadcasts and the court findings changed something in how the conflict was seen from outside it. Now step all the way back and look at the 16 days as one object. This is the thesis, and the arithmetic carries it without any help. Day 1. 3 IRA volunteers shot on a pavement in Gibraltar, in an operation a court would later rule was planned in breach of their right to life. Day 10. At their funeral, a lone gunman with grenades and 3 more dead, and more than 60 wounded. Day 13. At the funeral of one of those dead, a crowd primed by what they had just survived, and 2 soldiers in a silver car who drove into exactly the worst place at the worst possible moment, and 2 more dead. 8 people in total across 16 days. And here is the line that holds the whole case file together. Not one of those 8 deaths would have happened in the way it did without the one before it. Gibraltar made Miltown the most watched, most dangerous funeral in the country. Miltown made MacBroadig's funeral a place braced for attack. And that bracing, that certainty that another attacker was coming, is what turned a wrong turn by a silver Volkswagen into the deaths of 2 men inside it. The men who planned the operation on the Rock had one objective, and, in their account, met it in 27 seconds. They could not have imagined the cemetery on the hill, or the lone figure throwing grenades across it, or the silver car on the Andersonstown road, or the helicopter filming from overhead. No planner intended any of it. That is the nature of these operations, and it is why this channel keeps returning to them. A single security action does not have a single consequence. It has a chain of them, running on after the people who started it have closed the file. The 27 seconds were the easy part. They were over almost before they began. The 16 days were the rest of the bill. 16 days. It started with 3 IRA volunteers shot dead on a pavement in Gibraltar, in an operation a court would later rule had been planned in violation of their right to life. It ended with 2 British corporals beaten and shot in a taxi firm yard in Andersonstown, their last moments filmed from a helicopter overhead. In between, a lone gunman turned a funeral into a killing ground. 8 people died in those 16 days, and not one of those deaths would have happened in the way it did without the one before it. The SAS planners on the rock could not have imagined the Belfast Cemetery, or the silver Volkswagen, or the helicopter footage. That is the nature of these operations. The 27 seconds end. The consequences do not.